I'm Daryl Labar. I'm a solution architect out of Indianapolis, Indiana. And in today's session, we're going to be talking about unit testing CRM. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. The more dialogue we have, probably the better this is going to go and the more entertaining this will be. So first of all, we'll go through some disclaimers. When I say unit testing, I may mean automated, I may mean integration, or I may mean functional. Very rarely will I actually mean the normal definition of unit testing where you are testing a single particular method by itself in total isolation and everything else. So I'm just more so doing automated testing than anything. I'm going to skip the why of why you want to do testing. I'm assuming we all know it's fewer bugs, or we want to do test-driven development or behavior-driven development or whatever. I'm going to skip that, and we're going to focus on testing. Automated testing of the .NET CRM SDK calls. So you may want to test an external application that connects to CRM, be it a web app or a web service or something that utilizes the CRM SDK, or just our standard plugins and custom workflows. So, first of all, what is Extereme Unit Test? It's an open source testing framework. I've been developing it for the last about 4 years now. It's just designed to be efficient and to make your unit tests as beneficial as possible to you as quickly as possible. At its core is a fake CRM service. We'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. And also some other options like assumptions and entity builders and such forth. It has no external dependencies, so you can add it without worrying about adding or being dependent on some other technology outside of the SDK. It also means you can use whatever testing framework you want to use. It's not dependent on any testing framework in particular. It's available on NuGet, and you can go and fork it on GitHub if you want. Actually, right now, if you want to, you can go ahead and download it from that URL down there, github.com/daryllebar/exterem-unit-test, and you can follow along with me if you'd like. Everything that I show in our actual presentation today is already in the actual solution itself. So CRM automated testing. It's a big pendulum as far as where you go and how they actually do testing. On the left-hand side, you have the I never do testing, but we don't do any testing. On the right-hand side, you're doing things that are kind of the crazy application lifestyle management solutions that Shan MacArthur came up with ADX Studios, and that's to spin up a brand new test environment and to test against that particular environment with all the test data that you have preloaded and everything else, and you run your test in isolation on that test environment. So obviously it doesn't take any time to not test your code, and it may take 45 minutes to an hour to go through and set up your new environment in order to test with the other way. So that's kind of the testing pendulum. This means that you may take an extremely long amount of time to actually get benefit from doing fully automated testing using a multi-server environment. It also means that if you aren't doing any testing, it may cost you nothing to begin with, but over time it's going to cost you in the long run. So Extereme Unit Test attempts to kind of fit this line where it becomes immediately beneficial and then continues to be beneficial the more you use it. So we're going to go ahead and kind of get started here for testing. We're going to test a simple example, one that we actually aren't even connecting to CRM. So this is just a plugin itself that is running, and all the thing it's doing is it's accessing the target in the context and updating that. It's not actually doing any queries against CRM or anything like that. It uses some plugin-based handlers that are in my actual Extereme Unit Test framework. You don't have to use those. You can use your own. The only thing it does by you is it does define much easier and much more typed the way of defining when a plugin actually executes. Is it pre or post? Is it for create or update? And so forth. So let's go ahead and look at our first little test here. We're going to test this remove number formatting. Now I'm assuming we've all written a plugin sooner or later, or we will in the near future, where we actually are removing formatting, so that way when we do searching at CRM and phone numbers, we don't have to guess the format, we know what the format is. The logic of this is fairly simple. It goes through and gets the target and loops through the different telephone fields and removes the formatting each of those fields in the target, and then lets the operation continue. Since it's being done on a pre-operation, so our registered event pre-operation, since it updates the target, that'll update CRM without you having to actually explicitly call update. So remove formatting just goes through and says, hey, set whatever that value is to whatever it is right now, where the character is a number. And anything that's not a number is just completely ignored. So that's our basic plugin to be testing here. Now let's go ahead and look at our actual unit test. I've named these things in the format of the actual plugin, the state being tested, and then should, and then the actual expected results. So in this one, contact has formatting, should remove formatting. So in our test here, we're going to go through and say, hey, this contact has some phone number value fields that shouldn't be there. Let's go ahead and remove those. Oops, I went in the plugin. I have an advanced and a simple here. The advanced is the plugin is advanced in that it's inheriting from a plugin base that's in the middle rather than directly from the DLB plugin base. So that way you can add whatever defaults you want to add to your plugin base. The simple one here, it's just straight from it. That's the only difference. Our test is our plugin here, and it's an iRegistered events plugin, so that's an event that's in the actual plugin unit test framework that says, hey, I have defined these registered events to execute against. You can have your own plugin that doesn't do that. You can just have an I plugin instead. But in this case, I've typed it to that. So I can go through and actually populate the registered event in the actual context. I have my contact. Actually, if we remove these to kind of begin with here, and we need, that's fine. Okay, so we get our plugin passed in, we got a contact, and somehow we need to get that contact into this execute method with the provider. And I'm going to work backwards here. The provider is a iService provider, so I provide a service provider builder to go through and fluently build up that actual provider. In this case, we just have a context. That's the only thing we're passing in. Well, where do we get the context from? The context is an I plugin execution context. So we have a plugin execution context builder to build that. And it goes through and does the registered event that the plugin context is going to be executing for, and then the target. Target's that contact. So it goes through and runs and asserts that 123 is the mobile phone number rather than AB1, A1, B2, and C3. So we can go ahead and run that real quick. Cool. Passed successfully. All right. Next, let's look for an instance where we're actually connecting to CRM and doing some work in it. So here's where this is where that fake ironization service comes into play. Normally, if you're going to be doing unit testing against CRM, you're going to be, without using any sort of framework, you're probably going to end up using something like MS Fakes or another faking or mocking framework out there to go through and actually create instances of your interfaces that you're going to be using. I'll show how this is done in MS Fakes just to give you an example, but most of the frameworks are going to look very similar in this generic sort of fashion. This time, rather than doing that plugin for modifying the actual phone number, we're going to have a new one that's making the name match case. I have a capital B in my last name, and not a lot of times people don't capitalize it, so I want them to match that case. So the method accepts a name. This is an actual plugin. This is just an actual business logic method here. Method accepts a service and a name. It goes through and queries the contacts for that name, if it's the first name or last name that matches, and then goes through and actually does the actual check to say, hey, do I have any contacts where that first name is equal to the name, but the case is not equal? And if it is, then I'm going to go ahead and update that first name the name given, and update it in the actual context. Same thing with last name. So that's all it is. Let's go ahead and actually run through our actual test here. So by default, on GitHub, I use @var to go through and build my projects and unit test everything on each check-in. @var does not support MS fakes because it does not requires the version of Visual Studio that isn't free. So in order to do that, you have to go through and all you have to do is add the Microsoft Extereme SDK.dll reference as a fakes assembly and uncomment the test. I'm just going to uncomment the test now. You're free to spend some time in your own time if you'd like to make sure it works or to prove to yourself that it does. I'm just coming out just for some readability here. And how does this work? Well, when your arrange method here in your test, you have to actually go through and fake out or tell exactly what should happen when someone calls that interface. So in this case, the only thing that actually we need to work on is the execute organization request. That's the only method that we're going to have to go ahead and knock out. The problem is now I've got to go through and say, okay, is it a retrieve multiple or is it an update? So I've got separate sections for that. That's the retrieve multiple, and this is the update. So it's got to go through and it's going to get the response, generate the response, and just say, hey, whenever you query, whenever you do a retrieve multiple request, I'm not going to look at anything that you're sending. I'm just going to automatically return a contact with the last name McDonald, lowercase. And then whenever you go to update, I'm not going to actually do the update. I'm going to take that update and set this variable here, which is outside of our service here. And from that variable, then I can actually do my unit test and say, okay, what variable got updated and what did it get updated to? So now we have our actual act. It goes off, it does the match name, make name match service, the capital D in McDonald. It'll go through and assert, yes, it is not null. So we actually did get an update statement that came through. And then it goes through and makes sure, okay, is that actual update value, is that last name McDonald, the capital D? If it is, it's great. If not, then we have an error, right? So that's how you do it using MS fakes. For Extereme unit tests, this is how I do it. Notice that there's no scrolling involved for this. I have a local CRM database, and I have a method to create the organization service, giving it the CRM context. So the CRM context, why is that important? Well, that's used to look up the namespace of your early bound entities, and then it uses your early bound entities to define what attributes exist in your CRM instance and what entities exist. So that way you can be sure that if you attempt to set a value of an entity that doesn't exist, when it goes and hits the fake CRM service, it'll throw an error. It'll throw the same exact error that you'd get if you did it in a real life version of CRM. This attribute name doesn't exist. So that's our service. Now when we go and look at it, we're doing a standard CRM create. If you have lots of people in your team and lots of newer developers that aren't used to doing unit tests, this type of code is very difficult for them to understand. This type of code is what they're already doing in CRM, and so it's much easier to understand what's going on. Got a service, I'm creating it, I'm getting back an ID, I'm going through and I'm saying, okay, go ahead and match my case, and then rather than having to keep track of that thing, I'm just going to go out and get it out of the service, or get it out of the CRM again, and check that last name. From here to here, you have no idea that this is not a real version of CRM. Only this line right here gives it away that it's not a real version of CRM. So that's just an example of the difference there. It's a lot easier to use. It's a lot shorter, a lot more concise, and it's a lot more normal for what you're normally coding in. Is in a completely different way of coding in order to do those fake calls. Okay, but this does bring up some issues that we have. There are some limits using this fake organization service. First is foremost is security. It doesn't do anything with security for two reasons. One, it's rather hard to implement that, to say, okay, you can only do this if you have access to that record. But two, it's just as hard to go through and define in your unit test what you want your security to be. And so for those two reasons, it does not support security. It also has some information that it can only grab the information that's in your early bound entities. So if you want the actual text name of an option set, it won't give that to you. It will give you the best guess at what the text name is of the option set based on the enum that you have generated for the option set. But besides that, you have no idea. If the entities that you are running your unit test again are different, that's another issue you'll have. If they're different than your actual version of CRM, your unit test may pass, but if the CRM instance is different, then you may have an error. For example, if you think an attribute is of type string, and in the CRM it's actually a type int, well, you'll have an error then. And it's not CRM, so if there's going to be issues, there's going to be things that aren't exactly the same, and you may run into it sooner or later. I have attempted to do as much as I can to get it to even parity, but there are going to be bugs in it, and there are things that CRM will do that this will not do. So that's another issue. It also doesn't help if you have an environment that's broken. You have all these unit tests that never touch any environments. Well, why is this environment working and this one isn't? Well, if you could point it to an environment and run your test, you'd be able to see what's going on. So anyway, those are some of the limitations. So kind of, how do you get around those limitations? Well, you actually connect to CRM to do your testing. And then that kind of brings up some new questions as well. Well, how do you specify how to connect? Kind of two options. The first one is you create two different tests, one for local and one for server. And then the server ones always connect and the local ones always don't connect. But that means that you have people that already have a hard enough time creating unit tests to begin with, and you're asking them to create twice as many unit tests. That's not going to work very well. The other option is switching back and forth, which is valid. If you want to say, okay, I want to test against local this time, and I want to test against server next time, great. You just really should have a single point configuration for that, and it should just work out of box. If you get latest from source control, brand new, you should be able to set up itself without having to do anything new. So in order to handle this, there's two things that the Extereme unit test does. It has a unit test config path to be able to say, hey, here's a config path to determine whether to connect to CRM or whether to run in memory. The reason that you would use a config path to a config file rather than a standard app config is that more often than not, you're going to have multiple unit test projects. You want a single place to change or configure whether you're hitting CRM or not hitting CRM. So that's why we use a separate config file for that. And the other thing you also need is you're going to need your early bound entities. So there's a path to get to the early bound entities to figure out what your actual CRM in-memory instance should be. So, but that's how you actually connect to CRM using the Extereme unit tests. Now, if we are going to connect to CRM, we're going to have some requirements around this as well. Number one, we want them to be environment agnostic. We don't care what environment we run the unit test in, it should work. And not only should it work, it should be a good Boy Scout and leave it just as good as it was, the environment as good as it was as when it arrived as when you leave. So it should have no data that you leave in the environment after the test is done running. And the data that's ran should be unique and should be everything that is needed should be in the actual unit test itself. So that way, you're not dependent on all these values being in an environment. You can spin up a brand new environment and point to it if you want. The environment's going to be empty, but so is your local version as well. So you're going to have to define it in both cases. So we also want to make sure that it doesn't create data that we don't know about, because if you get data that gets created that you don't know about, then you're going to have an issue with how do you clean that data up. If I don't know it exists, if I don't know it got created, I don't know how to clean it up. And no matter what we do, we have to make sure the cost justifies the means. So there are lots of times where you can spend an exorbitant amount of time trying to go through and handle all these cases. And it is very hard. It's hard to be able to do easy, and it's hard to be able to do simple. And that's something that both I try to strive in the Extereme unit tests. So let's walk through a real example here, a real world example. We're going to have a hypothetical plugin, sync account to contact. And all it's doing basically is on the update of the contact, it finds all accounts that are associated with it and goes, oh, did you update the address? You did? Okay, I'm going to update all the address information on the actual account for the contact. This makes sense in some orgs, not necessarily in others, but hey, just an example, right? So our unit test we're going to walk through creates the account and the contact in the arrange section of the test and deletes the account and the contact in the finally. So the question I want you to ask yourself, is it environmentally agnostic? Here's the actual connections that we use for connecting to CRM. We have a test settings class. Let's find an XRM unit framework. We have a user test config path. Talked about that. And we have a method to configure that. Because generally you're dealing with a type that you're in your actual base test project, you want to, it becomes kind of hard to give the actual path to that, because depending on how your folder structure is, the path may be different. So you can't use the path of the code that's running it, you have to actually use the path of something else. So I have a pathfinder project of type, which basically says, hey, whatever project contains this test method class base, you can change it to whatever you want. This is what you'd configure, but hey, for this example, whatever has that test method class base, I want you to go find the config in the root of that project that is user test settings.user.config. So if I look at my example.ms test base, that's where my test method class is defined, and that's where the config is defined. Now I have a user.config and a .config. The .config is the exact same thing as the user.config, except it gets checked into TFS or gets checked into source control, and it does not contain any password information. It's just set up to automatically run in memory. The user config is set up to not be checked into memory, not be checked into source control, and it does contain a user ID and password. And I put the password right at the bottom, so that way you don't accidentally open it up and someone go, oh yeah, there it is. But here's our little setting and say, hey, use local CRM database or not, true or false, and that will enable or disable your connecting to CRM. So, all right, so testing a plugin locally or against CRM. Let's go ahead and update this to actually run against CRM. So go back to my setting here. I'm going to set this to be false. Okay. And then I already talked about the account, the plugin, when it does. Let's go ahead and look at our unit test here. So I call this one dirty because it's a bad example. Don't use it, but let's just hold our reasoning till later. So I call my test initializer to initialize my test settings. That includes the config path to figure out whether I'm connecting locally or not connecting locally. And I have a test base class to go through and actually create my service. And it's basically reading from those settings and doing that kind of stuff. Then we have our creates. We are setting the primary contact of the account to be the contact that we created. And then we have our actual test here of getting our contact, assigning it as a target to the plugin, first registered plugin, yada yada yada, execute our plugin, hey, make sure that we get the account out and that the account address is equal to the contact address. Notice we never defined anywhere that the account has an address, so therefore it must have been updated by this plugin. And then finally we go ahead and clean up. So the question is this environmentally agnostic? Well, let's think about it. It's creating all the data it needs here, contacting the account, and it deletes it back here. So it looks fairly decent, right? Let's look at some things here of what we might want to change here. So first off, we don't want to be calling this every single time. You should only have to initialize your test settings once, and you don't want to be calling that every single time. You just want to be able to get a service. 9 times out of 10, you're going to want a service, so you should just get it without having to call anything. Just give it to me as a parameter in my method. Other issues, cleanup happens down there at the bottom, the finally, but nothing's stopping the developer from stopping above it and quitting. It happens a lot of times when you're going through a unit test and test-driven development. You make some changes, you're unit testing, you go, oh, this is wrong, you stop unit testing, make your fix. Well, now guess what? You never cleaned up your entities that you deleted. So next time you run to begin with, your test is going to fail because those entities already exist in your environment. Yay! The other issue is this is manual at the bottom. There's nothing that's forcing a person to go in and add those delete statements. So how do we get around that? It's kind of another fun issue we have to talk about. So it's not really that environmentally agnostic because it will potentially leave those entities out in the environment, and when it runs again, it'll fail. So by definition, that's not environmentally agnostic. So that brings up our issues of, hey, we got to handle cleaning up data pre and post test. We have to ensure that entities that are created are always cleaned up. We also have to handle the testing a plugin locally when you may actually have that plugin already deployed to the environment. So you may have issues where the environment in CRM itself already has a plugin deployed that is messing around with your actual testing. So that's kind of a hoop that you have to kind of jump through sometimes. And then how do you deal with tests requiring system users? You can't. You have to use ones that already exist. You can't create new ones, right? So that makes it kind of a pain point to use CRM solely as your only method for testing. It's also rather slow too. So anyway, help is on the way. The Extereme unit test framework provides a test method class base. Now this seems a little bit strange, but there's reason for having an actual class for each test. I'll go on that later, but it favors convention over configuration. So if you think of MVC, where if you call methods certain ways, or if you define them certain ways, like your properties, your parameters to your methods, those are the same values that are used to figure out when you actually send any requests what parameters get mapped to which. So those are just convention over configuration type ideas. I like to call it magic. Test method class utilizes these IDs class. An ID class is just a simple way of being able to convert from an entity to an entity reference to a GUID to the logical name of an entity. So it has a whole bunch of implicit operators that go through, and depending on what you're asking for, it'll just give you what you want without having to go through and figure it out. So it makes it just a lot simpler to write. But these IDs that it uses also is what's used to clean up the test data. You don't have to go through and create a new service on your test. It will give you one by default. That service has some things defined on it already, logs all the requests, forces IDs to be defined, and it actually names the actual entities themselves. And then we also mix use of entity builders and environment builders. We'll go into a little more detail on that later, but they're just fluent classes that help you to create your code and create your entities and decrease the amount of code required to do that. So let's go ahead and take a look at testing this. Go to my walkthrough. And again, this walkthrough is in the actual GitHub repository. It's found in the example.walkthrough project down here. And so you can go and play with it or look at it however you'd like to do with it. So testing a plugin locally or against CRM agnostically. This is our test method. It creates a class and calls test on it. That class inherits from a test method class base. It defines for it two IDs, account and a contact. So it's the same exact thing we were dealing with our other unit test up here. We've defined an account and a contact to be created. We'll have a little method here to initialize test data. Now you don't have to utilize this, but it does kind of help separate the setting up of the test data to the actual preparation of the test and the arrange and the actual test itself. So I'm just updating the account to say, hey, the primary contact in the account is this contact, and then go ahead and update this. So this commander with entities is smart enough to go look at all the entities here and create the entities that you've defined. which is kind of cool. Now in our test, we have our range with our creating of the contact for use as the target, with a registered event that we're running for, and a provider. We execute it, and we assert it at the end. So there's nothing in here that's telling you that it's against CRM, not against CRM. It'll work in both cases. That is controlled entirely by the actual config value for it. So let's go ahead and test this one. If I spell true right. Nope. Actually, we already have that set. So let's go ahead and test this one. We're going to go ahead and test this in CRM itself. I'll put a nice breakpoint in here. And this is called update. Sync contact to account. That's the dirty one. That's alright at the top. Alright, cool. So go ahead and run that. While that's running, I'm going to go ahead and log into my CRM instance here. Okay. It ran through already. Why did it run through already? Oh, because I didn't put a breakpoint in it. So I lost that. Alright. Let's try again. Oh, that's the wrong class. That's not what I wanted. I want this one. Okay. Let's go ahead and run. Get to that. Oh, I know what happened. Let's see if we can run it from here instead. Cool. Alright, XUnit and or ReSharper and MS Test don't play along very well sometimes, so that's what happened there. Alright, so I'm here. If I reload this, my environment, I should see that we created a contact. Make sure everything's... I'm going to delete this because that's not that. I don't think it is. Wait, that is that. That is that. I got thinking of the dirty ones when I got thinking of. So let's do the dirty one first. Okay. So I'm here. I'm going to reload this. Look, it exists. It's just blank. So that doesn't help a whole lot. But it's there. If I look at the... No, it's there. We actually connected and ran it through just fine. If I go through and let that run through. I think it just finished. I go back to my contacts and refresh. Yeah, nothing. No contacts. Alright. Now we go back to this one. I went through that one. And now we refresh. We actually have our unit test here. It actually gave it a name, which is nice. And I can go through and do my unit tests. Runs through, gets that, goes and gets the account, make sure the account address line 1 is the same as that one, and it is. And so I can go through and run. I'll let that finish. And now I refresh. It's gone. So that's how you go through and connect to CRM. If I want to run against, let's see here, will it show me? I'd like to see some timing for this. Okay. Also spit out here the actual SQL statements that were ran, basically. So anytime that we connected to CRM, even though it's connecting to CRM, it will record that before it actually sends it over to CRM. So that's helpful. You can see how long that took. So let's see, is there timing here? Okay, so apparently ReSharper doesn't keep timings for it. That's okay. You can see it took a second and a half to go through and do retrieve multiple, 148 to do that one. So it took over a second and a half just to clean up the pretest data. Validate, assumptions, create unit test. So it's the actual time to do the unit test itself, 36 milliseconds, and so on. And then clean up at the end of half a second. Now if I switch it over to running in memory, okay. Okay. This time, did it actually switch over? Okay, I haven't used ReSharper unit test before. Maybe I should just disable it for the actual project here, but did figure out what the options were, and I did see that I have to run it twice in order for it to actually pick up the user test setting. So I'm not sure what that is. I'm gonna just maybe I just won't use this in the future. Okay, I'm up and running again. It's not working now. Now I can run that just normal. I probably don't want to breakpoint in there. Let's run it without a breakpoint in there, see how long it takes to run against. So 730 milliseconds. That's how long it takes to go through and do all that stuff in memory. So that's not too bad. Okay, so talked about creating that data and deleting it. What about things that you can't create or can't delete, like users? We talked about that before, right? You can't just create a new user. You have to have a, have it be in the actual domain or in the actual Active Directory, that kind of fun stuff. And usually that's not something you want to be doing in your unit test. So how do we deal with that? Or let's say we want to assume that we have a product that we are always selling. Stuff that we won't ever really change. We just reference it maybe from other entities. So how do you handle that? So I handle that through something called assumptions. And basically, this is data that you are assuming to exist in your environment. So the data should exist in every environment that you're connected to. If it doesn't exist and you connect to the environment you test in, it's going to throw an error right away and say, hey, you made this assumption. It doesn't exist. When you actually do run it against CRM, it will download the entity that it found and store that as XML. So that way you can run it in memory and have it run in memory and have it exist without having to define anything. They're super easy to create. If you look at our actual walkthrough here, all they are, they inherit from an attribute, and they define one method retrieve entity. You define the values you want to return. Those are going to get stored in the XML, and then the actual where statement here at the bottom. Okay, the product number equals install, and that's it. So that's going to be executed. It's going to return back an entity. The entity will get stored in XML when you're running it against CRM, and if it's not there, like an error, and we're running it locally, it'll just go ahead and create that for you. So we'll just go and grab the XML that already exists and use that. So everything exists in our MS test here. Assumptions, this is our product install. If I look at the actual XML, see we have an install for the product number, an ID, and a description. So those values don't get deleted. They just are assumed to be there, and they shouldn't be changed by our unit test. So let's see an example of using this assumption. You annotate your test method class, and that's it. You just annotate it, and the test method class will use reflection before it actually gets to your test to go figure out what assumed entities you have on your class, and it will call those for you. So that's a really, really great feature. You can access them through this assumed entities property. You just have to give it the actual attribute that you're wanting to return. So this is actually typed at this point to the actual product, which is nice. And then we go and actually get that product here in auto test by ID, get the description, and then we compare, hey, is the description of this assumed entity the same as the description of what I queried CRM for that product? And it's just a short little unit test to do that. So, again, yeah, fairly simple. You can group multiple assumed entities together if you'd like and have a collection of them, but I don't currently have an example of that to show you. All right, so those are assumptions. Next up, entity builders. So what the heck is an entity builder? Well, it's just a fluent builder for you to not have to spend as much time in each test case creating your entities. You can use it amongst different cases and reuse it. Let's take a look at our example here. We have an account builder. All this is, it accepts an ID as the actual constructor or not, and it always goes through and defines it to have an account number. It also has a fluent method here to say, with address, so that way, and lots of times you don't care what the address is, you just want it to have an address. So that's a method for you to be able to say, hey, create me a new account builder for this ID, and hey, give it an address with address 1. And then build, and that actually will get created. So if we get an example of this, we have our account builder with address 1, create, and then we have our test to say, okay, go ahead and get my account out, and go ahead and make sure it's not null, make sure I have an account number, and make sure I have an address 1, city 1. So that's just using the account builder. That's using an entity builder. So you can create your own for your own custom types. You should only have one account builder created or entity builder created per type. But it does make things a lot simpler and a lot more readable. So if I went through and defined, okay, I need a address like 1, I need a city, I need a state, that's 4 or 5 lines of code with things in it that you don't care about for this test, where this reads in very nice English of, hey, with account builder with address 1, go ahead and create. And okay, it's got an address. What it is, I don't know. If you actually care, you can set it manually, but for the most part, you don't. So you're getting code reuse and better readability. Just a win. Win-win. So that's entity builders. Next up are environment builders. We saw this already in one of our unit tests, but an environment builder is a way to go through and create all the entities you need for unit tests, and it does a lot of stuff automatically. You can use your IDs struct and say just create all these entities, and using the default entity builder, so it goes and finds that entity builder for that type and uses that, so that way you can have all that stuff being done without having to define anything for it. It also has methods for specifying just particular ones. If you don't want to create everything in your ID struct, maybe some IDs that you have defined you're going to be deleting, you're going to be creating later in your tests rather than at the beginning. That's a way to handle that. But with entities and with child entities, the child entities goes through and says, okay, I want to create this entity with this as a child record of it, and it does the wiring up for you. So first we have a test case here. IDs, accounts. We have an account with an address, an account without an address. So how do we build these things? Well, create an environment builder. We say, okay, with builder. And then in this case, we need to call an actual method on our builder. So how do we do that? Well, we say it is of type account builder. And then our ID, passing in our ID with address. And then, okay, on that, this thing's typed to the account builder. And so we can call our with address 1 on that. So say, I need you to call this with address 1 on my account builder when you're going through and executing this create method here. And then we need to go through and create the other account as well, one without the address. So there's two ways here. One is just say, hey, with entities, define of IDs, and yes, it's the account with address is defined twice, here and here, basically. So you can also just do with entities of just that particular IDs, if there's only some you want to create. So those are kind of some of your options there. And the test is pretty much the same thing, specifying that, hey, the address 1 is not null for one and is null for the other. So fairly simple there. And finally, set the parent account. So here's one where we want to say, I have an account and I have contact, make them play nice with each other, right? So with child entities, accepts a parent ID and then child IDs. So you can have more than one if you wanted to. You can have more than one contact or more than one entity with that actual account. And so when it goes through and does the create, it goes, oh, okay, well, you need this account, parent account created first. That way I can get an ID back, and then I'll go through and create these children, and I'll assign the ID and the parent account to the children. So it does it all for you automatically. You don't have to specify the actual attribute name. As long as there's only one, you get the first. If you get the one, if you get more than one, it'll grab the first. And most times that's really all you need. So it's kind of a fun little magic that does that and looks at your early bound entities and figures out, oh, here's the relationship, here's the attribute that I need to use, and I'll go ahead and populate that for you. So that's a lot of magic that happens underneath the scenes there. And again, our test case in this case is to go through and make sure that our context parent customer ID is the account that we define. So that's our building test environments with entity builders and environment builders. Let's also look a little more at this test method class base prioritization service. It gets passed in, it logs all the requests, forces IDs to be defined, and auto-defines names. So let's go ahead and look at that. Using the sync contact to account plugin that we were using before, going through, passing in the plugin, building it, executing it, passing in this logger. This logger is in the test method class base itself. It just implements this I test logger, which is just a fancier way of the I context text logger. What is it? Let's go look at that. Not that one. I tracing service. Very, very similar to I tracing service, just right line formatted. I tracing service is just the format without the single one. That's the only difference. It's practically the same thing. So create a service, go to execute, and now we go in and say, hey, I need to access my actual logs here. So if I look at that plugin, if there is no address here, it goes and spits out this message, address unupdated, no need to update the account. So how do I access that trace here? Well, because I passed in the logger in the test method class, it will go through and take anything that logs and add it to my logs collection here. And now I actually get to see whether or not it actually is there. So let's go ahead and run through that one real quick. This is my trace message. Test method class. Test method class, trace message. There we go. Alright, I'm going to run that. Now it's going to contain some trace messages that aren't in the actual plugin, that are actually in the base class of the actual plugin base class. So in the plugin base class I go through and say, hey, this is executing, and I say it's executing for message create, and then we have our actual message that we want to look for, address not updated, no need to update account, and then we execute. Hey, we're exiting the plugin. So that's all logged in there, and we can go through and see what's there and what's not there. That's kind of a cool little feature. Okay. Next up, let's get these IDs required. I have an account and I have a lead. Notice I don't actually create anything yet in my initialize method. On my test, I got a builder. This is for organization, so it's an organization service. So I'm using an organization service builder, and I want to say, hey, with IDs defaulted for create. Basically, that is saying, hey, if you are asked, Mr. Organization Service, if you are asked to create a lead, use this lead's ID and default it if it is empty. That's what's that saying there. And I create the account, ID is populated, this is okay, so I'm just passing the IDs, that's great. Now I'm creating an empty lead, no ID populated, but with IDs defaulted for create, this lists instead of asset value. So that one works just fine. The third one here says, all right, let's go ahead and create. Well, I've only defined one lead here. Now I've got a second one. This is going to be valid. So I'll throw an error and throw an exception and say, okay, this is not valid. An attempt was made by the server to create an entity of type lead, but no ID exists. And it'll even tell you that, hey, you shouldn't be calling new entity. So we shouldn't be calling with IDs defaulted for create. So that's the exception, and so that unit test goes through and just make sure that that is working. So this is the creative entity should require ID. It's fine. Onto that. Boom. Everything's good. All right. Next up was the creation of entity should define the name. So this is what we saw earlier where we actually had our name defined for our contact. How did that happen? I didn't define it anywhere. How does that happen? Well, there's some magic that goes on underneath the covers that says, hey, if you're going to be creating an entity, I am smart enough to figure out what the actual attribute is that defines the primary name for that entity. So I am going to go look up to see what that actual entity is, and I'm going to go and take the class that this was created for and take that entity name and set the class name to the entity name. So if I go through and actually run this test, let's see what my name is. Unit test dash creation of entity should define name. So creation of entity should define name. What's the name of my class? Creation of entity should define name. Well, look at that. It even goes through and splits it out for you, makes it more readable. And so that way, when you're looking at your environment, if your test fails halfway through, you know what tests you need to run in order to clear those up. So that's a great feature as well. And last but not least, there's a lot of code that's required for unit testing still, because we have to go through and define all those IDs. How do we make that simpler? And we have to define those classes. How do we make that simpler? Because it's kind of hefty, right? Normally people are used to writing test methods that are 3 or 4 lines. Well, yes, but test methods aren't normally set to run against a live version of CRM or not a live version of CRM. So there's a lot of overhead that's required that's been simplified down to those little helper methods. So how do we go through and do that? Well, we have some code generation. I have two methods, one either using LinkPad and one using code snippets. These are all in the actual solution itself. Under code snippets, there's our actual code snippets. There's also a LinkPad GUID generator text. So if I want to go through, let's say I want to create a new method class here. Let's say I'm going to create a new class here, a new test method, CRM test method class. Notice that matches that snippet. Alright, so the region here is the state being tested. Here is awesome. Actually, no, the unit testing is awesome. Xrun unit test is awesome. Should behavior expected is should receive applause. Okay. And then the plugin name for this is going to be whatever it happens to be, my plugin. Okay. Alright, and I'll apologize. I'm using XUnit testing locally currently, so that's a fact rather than the test method, so that's the only difference there. I think the actual checked-in version is for MS tests by default. So anyway, besides that, everything else is the same. It generated this whole test class for me. So now I need some entities. So let's say I need a campaign, a lead, an account. Oh, why don't we put another contact in here? And oh, what else do we need? Oh, another account. Why not? Okay. So I'm just gonna kind of put those in a weird random order here. But this is a LinkPad GUID generator, right? So writing this all out is kind of time intensive. Creating GUIDs is kind of time intensive. If you could do that with a snippet, that'd be awesome. But you can't execute code in a snippet for the most part. So this little LinkPad to the rescue. It goes through and generates some GUIDs for me. Let's go ahead and paste in my ID struct here. Alright, so it went through and it actually alphabetized everything. Accounts came first, campaigns and contacts and leads for all you OCD people out there. And if it was just one, it just defaulted it to that name. If it had more than one, it pluralized it and went ahead and added just A, B, C, D to keep those things separate. So you'd go through and rename those to whatever you'd like them to be. We have our test data initializer, great. Then we have our actual test. So here's another one we can use here. I've CRM plugin tests. And so what's the name thing we're testing? Well, I was gonna do my plugin, so let's do a plugin that we already have that exists here. So we'll do sync contact to account. Cool. That's the plugin. Here are contacts. It's going to do the first registered event. That's great. Service context. All right, that's good. And then we have an assert down here of some sort that we need to assert. But you can add in whatever assert you want, and everything should work. So for us, it's just going to fail because why not? But that's how long it took for me to go through and create all these IDs, and I could spend a little bit of time going through and actually giving them names. They did all exist by default. I could refer to them if I needed to, but that gives a base skeleton structure for what you need in a matter of seconds, which is great, and allows you really to be efficient in what you're doing. So at this point in time, I would open it up to questions. If people had any questions, we'd dive into some questions. I'm anticipating the actual talk to be a little bit longer because we will have some questions and I have some swag to give away. And yeah, but it took just about an hour, 59 minutes here for me to go through and do all this stuff. So yeah, I think that should work pretty well for my presentation. So thank you anyone that is listening to this. I'm hoping that means Brandon and John, and feel free to give me any feedback you'd like to give me, and I would much appreciate it. Thank you.